Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Andrew Bacevich. Andrew Bacevich is president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, based in Washington, D.C. He grew up in Indiana, graduated from West Point and Princeton, served in the Army, became an academic, and is now a writer. He is Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University. He has held fellowships at several prestigious institutions here in the US and abroad, and he is the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books. His most recent book is the subject of his talk, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. Dr. Bacevich states that American foreign policy has failed to adjust to a rapidly changing world with near catastrophic and far-reaching results. Endless wars and a succession of moral and material disasters. He offers a new approach based on moral pragmatism, mutual coexistence, and war as a last resort. He looks forward to a stimulating conversation with our group. So please welcome Andrew Bacevich.
Well, Linda, thank you for that introduction, and I thank you for the invitation to address the group. Linda's right. I'm going to talk briefly about my latest book called After the Apocalypse. So in essence, what you're going to hear is a book talk, meaning an effort to interest you in the book so that when we're done, you will rush out to the bookstore, rush out to the library, and quickly grab a copy. Or perhaps the discussion that's going to follow our talk will persuade you to the contrary. We'll see. It's up to you. So let me begin by saying that describing the inspiration for this book. The inspiration is quite simple. The multiple overlapping crises that all but overwhelmed Americans beginning in 2020, albeit in some respects even continuing down to the present day. I noticed at the time that the term apocalypse, the word apocalypse, began to appear with some frequency in media descriptions about what it was that we were experiencing. And the references were to massive natural disasters exacerbated by climate change, whether fires on the West Coast or storms in other parts of the country, floods, and so on. The reference also was to the vicious pandemic, which we were experiencing and continue to experience, albeit at the time I was writing the book, no antidote to the pandemic existed. I was prompted to write the book by the massive economic crisis that threw tens of millions of our fellow citizens out of work and destroyed millions of businesses. And while there certainly has been some recovery since, I think it would be wildly inaccurate to say that we're back where we were before the pandemic hit. At that time, also contributing to my decision to write the book, we had in the White House a commander-in-chief who, in my judgment, was incompetent and patently dishonest, and whose every action stoked divisiveness at a time when we needed to be a united nation. And not unrelated, I think, were the widespread demands for a reckoning with racism, which in turn prompted a white backlash. So as I experienced all of this, it seemed to me that we were undergoing the worst year in our history, our recent history at least, since 1968. And I'm young enough, old enough to remember 1968, a year marked by assassinations, by widespread civil unrest, by really a foolish war that had gone terribly wrong, and by domestic political upheaval. A terrible time. Nonetheless, it seemed to me that in many respects, 2020 was at least as bad, if not worse. Now, there are many vantage points from which to evaluate the significance of this apocalypse, as I called it. As someone with a particular interest in the relationship between the United States' self-proclaimed status as the world's indispensable nation and our claim to military dominion, I decided to reflect on how the events of 2020 could or should modify our role in the world. Now, the resulting book is very short. It's you can see how skinny it is. I think it's like 180 pages of text. You could read it probably in 2 hours or 2.5 hours. I hope you will read it. I hope you'll find it provocative. I hope you'll find some merit in it. But let me emphasize, I did not intend this book to be the last word. Indeed, as far as I'm concerned, the book will succeed if it encourages some debate and discussion, some of which perhaps we'll have today when I finish talking. Now, let me admit that I have very few expectations that members of the so-called blob, the foreign policy establishment, will welcome any such debate. And I did not write the book in particular for members of the blob or even for my own baby boomer contemporaries, but I think I wrote it for younger Americans who may well be shocked and baffled by the disasters that have fallen their country of late. They should be shocked and baffled. In the 30 or so years since members of my generation came to power in the United States and concluded that history had ended, famous phrase, with America the ultimate victor, I think we, that is to say my contemporaries, have made a hash of things. Given my own personal background and my professional interests, I've long since concluded that our nation's grotesque misuse of military power provides one, just one, important explanation for all that went wrong. I think evidence that we've lost our way is everywhere. In the book's introduction, I write that after the apocalypse, the book, that after the apocalypse is a reflection on manufactured memory. I'll repeat that phrase, a reflection on manufactured memory. Now, in a sense, all history is manufactured. History interprets the past. And the answers that history offers are conditional rather than final or definitive. Underlying my book is the conviction that in the present century, we Americans, can no longer satisfy ourselves with interpretations that prevailed in the prior century, in the 20th century, and in many respects have prevailed since 1776. In other words, when it comes to the American past, both distant and nearby, we have a lot of rethinking to do. So after the apocalypse explores various manifestations of manufactured memory. And in doing so, it suggests that manufactured memory be replaced with interpretations of the past that are more relevant to our present dilemmas. We need a past that helps us understand those dilemmas rather than camouflaging them. So among the topics that I discuss in the book and will be happy to explore in our discussion today, among the topics I can discuss are the following. Number one, where to situate the United States in the arc of history. Here's a hint. The so-called American century, which is what the 20th century was frequently referred to, the American century is gone for good. Second point, the commonplace notion that the United States is part of a larger conglomeration called the West, even if the West exists, which I doubt, that proposition no longer makes sense as a way to position the United States. I think we have become a post-Western people, a post-Western nation, and it's time for us to face up to that fact and explore its implications. Third point that I discussed, the poisonous effects of so-called special relationships, notably ours with the United Kingdom and with Israel. Now, George Washington warned against the consequences of special relationships, and I, for one, still take that warning quite clearly. I think special relationships interfere with efforts to see one's own interests and to see the world in a realistic way. But I argue in the book, if the US really wants to cultivate special relationships, then it should do so with Canada and Mexico, which after all are the two nations that are most important to ensuring our own well-being, our near neighbors. Fourth, the establishment's refusal to acknowledge military failure and thereby assess its implications, another topic that I discuss. And I refer here to the de facto defeats that we have sustained in Iraq and Afghanistan, with defeat defined as a failure to achieve our stated political objectives. When the book came out, we were still in the final stages of Afghanistan. It's only after the book was published that the collapse of the US effort there occurred. I talk about the implications of continuing to abuse nature, which quite frankly seems to be integral to the American way of life and is now vividly on display in the ongoing climate crisis. I talk about the difficulty of imperial management when in denial regarding the existence of an American empire. And I finish with a speculative chapter on why the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement may, emphasize may, well mark a decisive turn in US military policy, a new perspective giving rise to new policies. Now, I am personally agnostic on the question of whether or not the United States is objectively in decline. I think only time will tell. But I am emphatic regarding the imperative of giving up on the illusions that have informed the thinking of political elites, especially since the end of the Cold War. It's time to come to a more realistic and modest understanding of our place in the great unfolding drama of human existence on planet Earth. Now, let me say straight out, Donald Trump was far and away the worst president in the history of our republic. Yet not long after he was elected in 2016, a reporter asked Trump to explain his friendly attitude toward the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. He's a killer, the journalist charged. There are a lot of killers, Trump replied. You think our country is so innocent? This was an extraordinary admission, especially coming from somebody who was about to become president, but it was also true. I think it's past time for Americans to give up on their claim to innocence, especially when it comes to our role in the world. Now, the opposite of innocence in this context is not guilt, it's self-awareness. And I hope that after the apocalypse might contribute, at least in a small way, to supplanting outdated claims of innocence with the moral awareness that a mature nation and people need. We badly need to reimagine our past in order to align it with the present moment. And doing so is a precondition for reconceptualizing our approach to national security. Rather than prioritizing threats out there, far away, we should, in my judgment, pay greater attention to those things that threaten the safety and well-being of the American people where they live. To me, that's a crucial phrase, where they live. What are examples of those threats? Well, they include dealing with the climate crisis, preparing for the next pandemic or the next phase of this pandemic, bolstering our defenses against cyber threats, securing our borders, and perhaps most immediately restoring some semblance of domestic unity along with a shared definition of the common good. An overarching theme for a new national security paradigm, I suggest, is sustainable self-sufficiency. That does not imply disarmament. It does not imply isolationism. It does imply a substantial reallocation of resources so as to pay greater attention to actually existing threats and somewhat less attention to concerns that are distant both geographically and temporally. Now, what might that mean in practice? Well, it might mean the reallocation of resources. Less money for the Pentagon, more money for agencies responsible for health, environmental protection, border security, and climate, to include improved early warning and more effective response. What that might that mean specifically? Well, it might mean let's give more money to buy airplanes for the United States Forest Service and a little bit less money for the Air Force to buy its airplanes. Perhaps a little more money to the United States Coast Guard, which in my judgment performs an invaluable service in any number of ways, and perhaps a little less money to the United States Navy. Let's have more Coast Guard cutters. Let's have a couple fewer nuclear aircraft carriers. I think what it also might mean in practice is a significant redesign of the United States military. The U.S. military is designed for decades, has been designed to provide for an instrument of global power projection, to be ready to fight out there in faraway places. It seems to me that the United States military ought to be paying greater attention to protecting the American people where they live. What might that mean in terms of specifics? Well, withdrawing the United States from NATO and insisting that the time has come for European members of NATO to take responsibility for their own security, which they are fully capable of doing. It might mean revoking the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine declared the Persian Gulf a vital U.S. national security interest and has found us fighting multiple wars ever since without much of a positive payoff. We should, in that regard, for example, close down United States Central Command. Treat the Gulf as a diplomatic problem, not a military problem. We should certainly, in my judgment, should maintain our military presence in the Indo-Pacific because there, in contrast, let's say, to the Middle East, in contrast to NATO, it both is necessary, needed, and also, in fact, does contribute to stability, not instability. I think it might make sense to create a North American security zone as the new national security priority. Again, focusing on threats that occur where we live. And of course, all of this should be undertaken in a context that prioritizes repairing the damage done to our domestic polity, something that, of course, is very much part of the conversation today. You know, at the beginning of the book, I make reference to a historian, long dead, by the name of Marc Bloch. Bloch was a very interesting figure, a Frenchman who had served as a combat soldier in World War I, had become a famous historian during the period between the two world wars. And in World War II, he was recalled to duty as an overage captain serving on a staff far away from the front lines, but nonetheless, somebody who was in a position to witness the catastrophic defeat that French forces experienced at the hands of Nazi Germany in the spring of 1940. He wrote a book about that. The book was called Strange Defeat, published in France during the war, and not in the United States until after the war. And I took a quote from that book and used it to introduce my book. And the quote goes like this: "Our war," wrote Bloch, "up to the very end was a war of old men, or of theorists who were bogged down in errors, engendered by the faulty teaching of history. It was saturated by the smell of decay." I think that quotation applies in spades to the United States in our time, in particular to the American leadership class that has brought us to where we are today. So with that, I will conclude, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have.
Okay, so as we said, folks, this is a more of a book talk. We now look forward to your questions. Let me add something about Andrew's book. We have sent him some book plates, book labels, which he is happily signing and sending them back to us. We're more than happy to help him circulate his book. So if anyone purchases his book and would like an autographed book plate from Andrew, all you have to do is express that in the chat, send us an email, indicate it on our website, lexmavets.com. I'll put that in the chat, and we will happily send you an autographed book plate from Andrew. And with that, we are happily going to entertain your questions. Maybe I'm going to I see we do have one. I was going to exercise my privilege, but no, I'll wait. Bob Lewis, let me see. Bob, where are you? You had a question. Bob, why don't you ask your question in person?
Andrew, I read your book, and thank you very much for it. But could you tell us, you say we need to establish exemplary communities that other people around the world can say as an example of how to establish a community. Could you tell us, what does an exemplary community look like, and what are the characteristics of an exemplary community?
Bob, you're cutting out a little bit, but I think the question was, what are the characteristics of an exemplary community?
Yes.
The most important, in my judgment, is the existence of a consensus regarding the common good. You know, in any country, and I think in particular in a country like ours, which is massive, population is now what, like 340 million? It's very diverse. To my mind, sometimes the beating the drum of diversity gets to be counterproductive. Nonetheless, we need to subscribe to a common conception of what as a people in a nation we stand for, believe in, aspire to. And I'm the last person in the world to want to glorify the past or be sentimental about the past. But I do think, however imperfectly, some conception of the common good did prevail until the relatively recent past. And today we have lost it. And I think the evidence that we have lost it is everywhere in front of us, and manifests itself in the level of acrimonious disagreement, bad faith arguments that are so much part of our daily conversation. So to me, the key phrase is common good. We need to rediscover it. We need to redefine it. We need to embrace it.
Okay, thank you. We have an anonymous question. How do we repair the damage done to our domestic polity? Did we mean policy or do we mean polity?
Probably polity.
Okay.
Yeah. So obviously, that's a great question. And if I could give you a persuasive answer, I would be a famous person in great demand. So it's a great question, but it's a tough one to provide any kind of a serious answer to. I think a preliminary step, I don't mean to say this is the solution, but a preliminary step would be to restore our two-party system, restore to our two-party system some semblance of principle. Now, I think it's possible to argue that the Democratic Party, I, by the way, define my own outlook as conservative. I think it's possible to argue that the Democratic Party, despite its many interior fractions, does, in a general sense, adhere to a worldview. I think, by comparison, the Republican Party is devoid of principle. And even if you're a Democrat, you should recognize that as a huge problem. In other words, my answer to this very pointed and complex question is, step number one, I think, is to reconstitute the Republican Party as an entity that stands for something other than Trumpism. And that is obviously a tall order and will remain a tall order as long as Trump himself remains a significant presence in our politics. We need, in my judgment, again, and I'm not a Republican, Republican Party needs to move for the sake of the country. The Republican Party needs to move beyond Trump. It needs to demonstrate that it stands for something, presumably standing for things different than the Democratic Party stands for, so that we can have a politics in which there's a real debate that might, in fact, identify, prioritize, and address real problems. But it looks like we're a long way from even achieving that limited goal.
Okay. Tom Elkind has a question. I'm going to read Tom's question, but Matt, would you kindly unmute Tom so that after Andrew responds to his question, Tom, if you want to make another response back to Andrew, you can, okay? His question is, you seem to be advocating a reduced international military role for the US. While that would reduce the likelihood of war with Russia and Iran, do you foresee any negative consequences to this strategy?
Well, international politics is fraught with uncertainty. So nobody, certainly not me, can say, well, here's the 5-point plan, and I guarantee that the result will be world peace and prosperity and liberty for the American people. You can't do that. It does seem to me that if we step back and look at US policy since the end of the Cold War, if we acknowledge the claims that informed that policy, expectations that informed that policy, we can say here in 2022 that it proved to be a costly failure. Where's the evidence? The evidence is in Afghanistan. The evidence is in Iraq. And therefore, it seems to me that the militarization of US policy, which in my judgment very much occurred in the wake of the Cold War, has produced very negative consequences. So we need to demilitarize US policy. Now, that's not a call for disarmament. It's certainly not a call for isolationism. It is a call for lowering our expectations of the role that military power should play in advancing our interests. If you go back and look at the expectations that informed our entry into Afghanistan and even more so, the intervention in Iraq, expectations of basically transforming those societies. It's not difficult, again, in retrospect, to see that we were just headed for a fall. And then when you think about how much those failures have cost us, not to mention the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, it's enough to make you weep. So I think recognizing the limited utility of military force would be a useful first step. I'm not arguing that the military power has no place. I think military power is needed to deter. In some circumstances, it's needed to deter. It's maybe needed to contain. Certainly, maybe needed to defend. But when it is viewed as an instrument for power projection that enable us to go out and change parts of the world, I think that's where we go wrong, and where we have gone wrong in the recent past.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with all of that. And certainly we've made a lot of mistakes militarily, at least going back to Vietnam. But I'm curious how your theory on all of this informs what's going on now with Russia's attempts to expand its influence in Eastern Europe.
Well, I had a conversation with somebody earlier today, and I said, it seems to me that when we get in these predicaments, it's always useful to try to look at the problem from the other guy's point of view. Not to sympathize, but to try to understand your opponent's perspective. And I think that's very true when it comes to the Ukraine problem. So how does all this look from the point of view of the other guy? Well, the other guy says, as a consequence of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, Russia was subjected to humiliation. Big promises made by Americans about reforming the Russian economy in ways that was going to, vault Russia to prosperity. Big assurances of sympathy for Russia that then found expression in the expansion of NATO eastward. Now, we may say, and we may genuinely believe, that NATO consists of a bunch of peace-loving nations concerned with their own security and well-being. But that may not be the way it appears from the perspective of the Kremlin. And so when the Cold War ends with handshakes all around, in the immediate aftermath, we've had that incorporating into NATO nations that had been Soviet allies, indeed had been part of the Soviet Union itself. It ought to be a little understandable about why the Russians would take offense at that. As we would, if, let's just imagine the unimaginable. Imagine if in 1961, the Soviet Union had dared to place offensive weapons in Cuba. We would have got upset. We did get upset. I think something of the same situation applies with regard to NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War. And now, of course, the nexus of the problem is that Ukraine, and understandably, Ukraine wants to join NATO. How can the Russians not take offense at that, take umbrage at that? It seems to me that they have reason to do so. I personally think that inviting, even hinting about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO was a massive error in judgment, played into the hands of Putin's thuggish instincts. So what do we need? We need diplomacy. Obviously easy to say, but we need diplomacy that finds a way to acknowledge the genuine security interests of Russia in a way that nonetheless keeps Ukraine out of Russia's clutches in a direct sense. That's what I assume, that's what the diplomatic effort underway right now is trying to achieve. I'm not in any kind of a position to say whether that diplomatic effort is going to succeed. I would say that a war centered on Ukraine would be a colossal catastrophe, and therefore the United States should exert itself as much as possible to prevent that from happening. It's a real danger, right? We need to try to prevent it from happening.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent exchange. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to turn to Tom Shipley. So again, Matt, if you will unmute Tom Shipley, just in case he wants to make a response. So Tom wants you, Andrew, if you will, please expand on your idea that the West may not exist. And to the extent that it does, we should reconsider our place within it.
Well, in the 20th century, the nexus of global power, at the beginning of the 20th century, the nexus of global power was Europe, principally Great Britain and France, including Germany, including Germany in a fearsome way, beginning in 1933, also including, to a lesser extent, Italy and Russia. And then the United States, for, I think, good and cogent reasons, not good and cogent reasons in 1917, but good and cogent reasons beginning in the late 1930s, began to identify itself as part of this community of nations called the West. And I think during World War II and during the Cold War, there was a certain value in deciding that we were part of this particular community. Value to us. Well, in 2022, the center of the world is no longer Europe. Great Britain, France, God knows why they are permanent members of the UN Security Council, because they are nations of a lesser rank in terms of their influence. In many respects, they forfeited their influence as the subjects of British and French imperialism began to bridle at the subordinate role in which they were kept. So what makes sense to me is for us to realize that that's not our club. We're not in a club that somehow consists of us and French and Brits and Germans and Italians. It is no longer really the nexus of international politics. I mean, countries like India, China, Japan, Brazil, Turkey, matter a lot more. So where should we situate ourselves in relation to those nations? I think we should have friendly relations with all and, intimate relationships perhaps with none. And the point also applies with regard to our domestic politics. When I was growing up, I think it was just taken for granted that we Americans had a special fraternal, if we could use that term, relationship with other Western nations. We and the Brits, we and the French, we and the good Germans, as opposed to the bad Germans, we're engaged in a common enterprise. I don't think that makes sense anymore. And quite frankly, one of the reasons it doesn't make sense is that back then, when I was growing up, it was pretty much taken for granted that the white race dominated, and our position of privilege stemmed at least in part from the fact that we were a nation in which the white race called the shots. Well, again, here we are in 2022. One would not want to say that out loud. We are a multiracial society. And our multiracial identity is at least one of the things that should influence how we relate to the world outside of our borders and who we relate to, who we connect to. So I don't think I'm always amazed by the way we Americans have this fascination with the British royal family, as if Elizabeth were our queen, as if Harry and William and Charles had something to do with us. They don't have anything to do with us. So I think we need to shed these old bonds of sentiment that relate to the period of when we called ourselves part of the West, and recognize that we actually stand alone as a multicultural society, that we should seek friendly and positive relations with every part of the world, rather than somehow seeing that we're connected to Elizabeth II, God save her.
Tom, do you wish to respond?
That was a wonderful response. I actually have a completely separate question that was prompted by your remarks that you can put to the end of the session if we have time. Just curious to know how your own views on the multiracial nature of our society have changed over your own lifetime that you've been thinking about these things. Thank you.
Oh, come on. I grew up outside of Chicago in the 1950s. Do you think maybe there was a modicum of racism in the air? Yeah. Where I grew up in Northwest Indiana, and there was no Jim Crow, in the sense that Black people were told to go, sit in the back of the bus. But there was a de facto racism. I didn't have any black people that lived in the neighborhoods that I grew up in. They were in some other neighborhood. So it was a pervasively racist society, and I think maybe I'm 74. Maybe there are some other 74-year-old Americans who grew up in other parts of the United States, white Americans who grew up in other parts of the United States who were unaffected by the pervasive racism that existed in the United States back, let's say, in the 1950s. I've never met those people. And if I did meet them, I would say, you're pulling my leg. Come on. Because it was pervasive. Why should we pretend otherwise?
Okay. Fred Martin is making several editorial comments to what you've just talked about. He says, but aren't we part of the Club for Democracy? That's not China, that's not Russia, that's not Brazil. And then he concludes, so you're definitely not a Wilsonian.
No, I'm not a Wilsonian.
Okay.
Who was a racist, by the way, as we now know. No, it's funny, when I was in graduate school, Princeton, this is probably getting us off track. One of my professors, deceased now, his name was Arthur Link, L-I-N-K, a brilliant scholar. And a brilliant scholar in particular of the early 20th century, and even more in particular, a student of Wilson and a great admirer of Wilson, meaning the Wilson who attempted to bring out of the war of 1914, 1918, something good, a new order, peaceful order. That was the Wilson that he admired. In passing, Arthur Link would mention that Wilson was a racist, but it was in passing. It was not a matter of great significance. It did not determine Wilson's standing in history. So here we are. That was like, what, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. At Princeton, Woodrow Wilson, former president of the university, is anathema. The Wilson School has had its name ripped off. Now it's called the Princeton School or something. I don't know what they call it. I cite this simply as an example of the way the perspectives change. We can have a big argument about whether that's good or bad, or it's overdone, or not done in a thoughtful way. But man, it's part of the mood of the moment.
Okay. Now we're going to shift. We're going to talk about climate change. We have an anonymous questioner. Can our present democratic system stand up to the challenges and the pressures of climate change, such as massive amounts of climate refugees within the United States?
Because these questions are asking me to prophesy.
Yes, we are.
And I am not a prophet.
True. Good point.
All I can say is this. What I'm willing to say is this. I think the American way of life, as we understand it, is incompatible with making a serious response to the climate crisis in a timely way, given the urgency of the situation. And therefore, if we are going to deal with the climate crisis, we have to acknowledge the need to change our way of life. Now, what do I mean by that phrase, way of life? It seems to me that that way of life, since the 1950s, earlier, but over my lifetime, has been based on consumption, choice and mobility. The practical definition of freedom is I can pick up and go wherever I want to go, whenever I want to go there, because I got a car in my garage and gas in the tank. It has to do with consumption, acquiring the latest gadget is essential to me enjoying a fulfilling life. Give me that latest iPhone. And choice. That there's an array of things that are accessible to me because I am an American. That's what we have come to expect. That's why it's so distressing when the price of gas goes up, or when there are failures in the supply chain, that the shelf doesn't contain the wide array of makeup that I would like to have available. Because these things are intrinsic to our understanding of what the American way of life is supposed to deliver. Well, it looks to me, I'm not a climate scientist. It looks to me we're going to have to curb those inclinations very seriously if we're actually going to make a real response to the climate crisis. And who is the national political leader who is willing to say that to the American people? Jimmy Carter tried that. Remember, way back when he gave his famous Malay speech? What was that? I think summer of '79, I think. The approximate issue was energy crisis, limited access to Persian Gulf oil. And Carter goes on TV and he gives his speech. I think he was wearing a little cardigan sweater. He goes on TV and he gives his speech and he says, if we need to rethink what freedom, what is entailed by the term freedom. We need to recognize that perhaps we have been pursuing a false conception of freedom centered on satisfying our appetites. Perhaps what we need to do is to rethink what freedom really ought to mean. And he said that, and the oil crisis provided the mechanism to begin to do that. It's a great speech, which you should read, in my judgment. It's available online. And man, it was a flop because the American people didn't want their president telling them to tighten their belts and get by with less. The obligation of an American president is to give us more, to guarantee that we can have more, not less. I think that's the essence of the dilemma.
Okay, we've got questioners piling up, so we're going to try and move along to get to more of them. So I didn't realize, so Arthur's iPad, Art Sotek goes by the handle of Arthur's iPad. Matt, would you unmute him, please? Go ahead. Go ahead, Art.
He's unmuted. Arthur, you're able to just unmute yourself.
Did it again. There I am.
There you go.
Okay. Good old Jimmy, he had those solar collectors on the roof of the White House. He did his part at least, even if the public didn't. But that wasn't my main question. I was hoping that we wouldn't have politics creeping into this. And as far as I know, only one politician or businessman of sorts has been invoked here. And that is the guy that always gets free publicity during the election and up to this time, and that's Trump. We got to remember that he received 38 million of the citizenry's vote. No, I mean 73 million. That was 10 times more than Biden beat him by. So there are an awful lot of people out there that like this guy, 73 million citizens. So every time you pick on him, you're sort of picking on those folks. And I'm not one of them. I don't want to say idiot, that incompetent ever got 73 million votes, I don't know. But the other thing that made me, that you raised a question in my mind is that, well, we're making this great transition, to a better world. And I agree with you entirely. I was very moved by the write-up that was in your announcement. That's a lot of really good stuff. A couple of things is we have social media to overcome. And the other thing is, while we're remodeling ourselves away from being a powerful military power and also being first in space, etc., Putin and China and all those other adversaries, they're not going to just sit around waiting for us. They're going to say, oh, great, we'll keep on producing our stuff because we're wanting to take over the world and spread. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
I guess I would say that I'm not persuaded that China is trying to use your phrase, take over the world. I'm not sure what that would mean. I'm not a historian of China, but I don't know that there's anything in China's history that suggests that that's their goal. I guess there was a time, let's say in the early days of the Chinese Revolution, back when Mao was the great helmsman, that the People's Republic demonstrated an interest in exporting their version of communism. I don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, they're not really a communist country. It's a one-party state governed by a communist party, but they are a model of capitalism. Maybe I should say capitalism combined with corruption. So I just don't see the evidence that they want to take over the world. I suspect they want to have a dominant voice in what occurs in their part of the world, in East Asia. And certainly that can pose problems for Japan and South Korea, Vietnam, perhaps Australia. So there's a heck of a lot of jockeying going on right now to determine what political order will exist there. Not for a second am I trying to suggest that jockeying is somehow has a simple resolution. I don't think that for a second, but I don't think it's useful to begin with claiming that China wants to take over the world or that Russia wants to take over the world. I think it's preferable to, it's not easy, but it's preferable to come to a more realistic understanding of what our adversaries are all about. And we do have adversaries. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Okay, thank you. All right, Henry, he posed his question a while ago. Let's get to Henry. Where does human rights fit into your worldview?
I favor them. Of course, there is potentially a big argument about, what do you mean by that phrase? And it doesn't seem to me that there is anything like unanimity. Probably considerable agreement on, certain basics. But I wonder if implicit in the question is another question, and that is, what should the United States be doing to support the human rights? Now, there was a tendency in the immediate wake of the Cold War to say, well, what we should be doing is using American military power to support the spread of human rights. And that resulted in US intervention of all kinds, that in my judgment, more or less, more often than not, was counterproductive. So, we should condemn people who are condemn regimes that are human rights violators. We should penalize them for their actions. We should reward them when they behave in a manner that gains our approval. But I'm not in favor of going to war, to really put it bluntly, in response to human rights violations. I suppose you can conceive of a scenario where the human rights violations are so horrible that it would be impossible for us to stand by and allow this to occur. And we immediately sort of go to the Nazi Germany notion. But by and large, I'm not in favor of using force to enforce human rights.
Okay. I want Roger Borghesani, Tony Galatsis, and Kathleen Melvin to know that you are next in line after this next question. We have not forgotten you. We are aware that you are in line. This next question is anonymous. What can we do as individuals to actually make or influence a change in the lack of principle in the Republican Party? I am so worried about the future of our democracy.
It's another one of these questions that if I could just give you a good answer.
I mean, we're not making it easy for you, are we,
on
Andrew?
the cover of Time
Putting
magazine.
you on the spot.
Oh, God, it would be great.
Yeah.
Well, when I get asked this question, here's my totally inadequate answer is be the best citizen you can be. What's that mean? Well, you decide, maybe being a good citizen is being a good neighbor. Maybe being a good citizen is to engage in local politics, run for the school board. Maybe it is to contribute money to candidates or causes that you believe in. Maybe it's demonstrate in the streets, carry a sign, denounce the evildoers. It's not for me to say what that would imply in realistic terms, but I think that's what you do. And you do it with a clear understanding that whatever you do probably won't make a heck of a lot of difference. I write books. I work hard at writing books. I hope you will read my book. But I don't write this book with any expectation that suddenly there was going to be a groundswell of opinion in the United States of America, the people who are going to rally to the viewpoint that I express. This is just, I'm doing my best. I think we all are called upon to do our best. And then you sort of let the chips fall where they may.
Thank you. Okay, Roger Borghesani, we have unmuted you. So go ahead and tell Andrew your question.
Thank you. My question deals with shifting national defense funds. If you go back to the 50s history where Dwight Eisenhower said that watch out for the military industrial complex.
Yep.
What I think here is that how do we deal with that with Congress and the military that are so powerful, and essentially the American public is so weak in dealing with this budget issue?
Well, wonderful questions that I can't answer. We elect these people, right? The Congress just passed a national defense bill that not only increased Pentagon spending, but increased Pentagon spending by an amount that was greater than what the Biden administration called for. I mean, there you got the military industrial complex at work. Basically, they are deciding the distribution of resources, and they make decisions that benefit themselves. You know, I think we should find that as unsatisfactory. If your elected representative is somebody who routinely votes for more money to the Pentagon without any sort of serious oversight, then you ought to try to vote him out of office. So let me give you an example of what may be a promising initiative. Congress also recently passed a piece of legislation that is going to create an Afghanistan War Commission. Group of 12, I think it's 12 citizens, who will be charged with a top to bottom critical examination of the Afghanistan war, the longest in our history. Let me emphasize, this is not an investigation of why the evacuation of Kabul was so screwed up. I'm sure it'll touch on that. But it's an investigation of everything that happened between 2001, when the war began, and 2021, when it ended. You know, the conduct of the war, oversight from the White House, the quality of generalship, the quality of intelligence, efforts to nation build, efforts to eradicate corruption, et cetera, et cetera. Comprehensive examination. I don't know who are going to be the 12 people who are on that commission, although interestingly, the legislation prohibits four-star generals, prohibits basically defense contractors. So there's at least a chance that the 12 people in the commission will be interested in a truthful investigation of this failed war. Now, my point is, this is going to have to, whether this, it probably ain't going to work out, but if it worked out, we might have an important example of truth-telling about the failures of US military policy that could, in theory, promote a willingness to rethink the premises of US national security policy. You know, I'm not going to lie awake at night holding my breath that this is going to happen, but it could. And so I think that's at least one little glimmer of hope on the horizon.
Excellent question, excellent answer. Thank you. All right, Kathleen Melvin, we are going to where are you, Kathleen? All right, talking permitted. Kathleen's question is, kindly share your perspective on US sanctions. By the way, how are you doing, Andrew? Are we tiring you out too much?
Yeah, yes, I am getting tired. I mean, if you want
Yes.
to, if that's an honest question, I'm giving
Yes,
you an honest
no,
answer.
we're only going to keep this up for
where's
about
me at?
another 5 minutes or so.
Okay, 5 minutes
We
sounds
really
great.
have given you a workout.
Yeah, I think 5
So
minutes is
I'm
great. So
watching the clock.
sanctions, I think.
Oh, but let me just give you her other
Oop.
comment. She has come to view it as a passive form of war because it inflicts so much suffering on people rather than an alternative to war. So I wanted you to have her viewpoint.
Yeah.
Okay, thoughts on sanctions?
Yeah,
And then
I'm not. You
Kathleen
know,
can respond.
I'm not for him. I'm not against him in a general sense. So, but let's go to cases. We imposed sanctions on Cuba really at the outset of the Castro Revolution, and we had them in place now for what is it, 60 years, with minimal positive effect. Certainly, the Cuba sanctions are an example of basically collective punishment by the United States imposed on a very vulnerable population. I would argue that whatever justification there might have been for sanctions, back in 1961, that justification is long gone. And I would strongly argue, this is, President Obama, to his credit, made moves in this direction. I would strongly argue for the need to normalize relations between the United States and Cuba. But for mostly domestic political reasons, of course, that doesn't happen. I don't think the failure of sanctions in Cuba leads to the conclusion that all sanctions are bad or that sanctions never work. I do think that if carefully targeted, they may have some benefit on the margin, although we shouldn't delude ourselves that it's going to have a decisive impact. So I'm giving you a wishy-washy answer, I think, on that one. It's a tough issue.
Okay. Let's see, Kathleen had another question, but I'm in the interest of getting as many as and I'm going to move quickly to Gary Shipley. Okay, talking about the Quincy Institute's mission and vision statement. As it applies to the peace, how would you characterize the size of the defense budget? Is it sufficient? More than sufficient? Not sufficient enough? Please talk about the money we spend on defense and what military tasks go by the wayside or get passed on to another federal department.
Okay, so it's the position of the Quincy Institute that the Pentagon budget is way too big. We don't favor disarmament. We don't favor zeroing out the Pentagon budget. We recognize that force plays a role in international politics, and the United States needs to have adequate forces to defend its vital interests. But I think I'm repeating myself here, but the military establishment is designed to project power. It's not designed to defend the United States. And I think this is a key issue. We need to get out of the power projection business and get into the business, I said this before, of defend, deter, contain. We'll still need defense forces. We'll probably still need some kind of presence abroad, although on a far more modest scale than we have right now. But I think the beginning of wisdom is to recognize that the power projection paradigm as a principle of national security policy hasn't worked. Indeed, it's backfired. So we need to rethink. We have to come up with a better answer to the question, why does the US military exist?
Woo. That's a lighthearted question for our next luncheon. All right, I think we only have time for one more question. And how about, let's talk a little bit of money. This is your last question, Andrew. One reality that significantly distorts the democratic process is the impact of money through lobbying, campaign donations, PACs. What changes would you make in how we finance campaigns to restore equal access to government decision makers?
God, I can't believe you people ask me these questions.
I know, we're really going after you.
No, I mean, so yeah, there's no question.
I told you that we had a very educated, curious, and aware audience. Do we not?
Absolutely. So,
okay.
Money corrupts American politics. Absolutely.
Okay.
No question about it. The Supreme Court has approved this reality. It was a United something, I can't remember the
Citizens United?
Citizens United, okay. We need to get the Supreme Court to change its mind. I don't know how to do that. be dependent on the kind of people that the president appoints, that the Senate approves. Probably there needs to be a change in the general climate of American opinion about the role of money in politics. But as long as it's there, as long as all this money is flooding into politics, of course, the people who are donating the money are doing it in order to advance very specific interests, usually related to making more money. So the answer is get money out of politics, but you can't do that until the Supreme Court revisits the Citizens United decision. I don't see any other way.
Well, I would like to apologize to the several people who had questions and we left them hanging. I'm really sorry. We did our best to get everybody in. But it just goes to show our prediction was that Andrew would be a very popular, sought-after speaker, and indeed he was. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's a wonderful way for us to start the new year with someone of your background and knowledge to share your time with us. We all very greatly appreciate it. We have benefited from it. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and we hope possibly you will come back and visit with us again.
That would be fun. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It was a good discussion. Good discussion.
It was a wonderful discussion. Folks, that concludes our presentation this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you again at our next presentation. And remember, if you would like a book plate, if you buy Andrew's book and you want a book plate, please let us know through email or through our website, and it would be our pleasure to send you a book plate. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.